So I'm here today to talk a little bit about the microbiota, and this includes all of the different types of bacteria, fungi, viruses that live on you and in you, and how they impact your health. So first of all, what is the microbiota? We'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk specifically about how it impacts your general health, both in terms of the immune system, the nervous system, and obesity, because these are really the three areas of research that have been worked on most so far. So you're never truly alone, because you're actually always inhabited by quite a number of different other organisms. And early estimates actually said that there were 10 times as many cells of bacterial or fungal origin in you as there are of your own cells. But recent estimates are actually saying that it's more one-to-one. So you're about half what you actually think of as you. So there's bacteria, viruses, and fungi that are all part of this microbiota. But we're really going to focus mostly on bacteria, because these are actually the type of bugs that are the most well-studied and that we have the most information for experimentally in terms of how they affect your health. So although we tend to think about the microbiota as really just being the bugs that live in your gut, they're actually all over you. Any part of you that is exposed to the air is going to be colonized by different microorganisms. And in this case, you can actually think about your entire gastrointestinal system as essentially being a tube that runs through you. And so it's exposed to the world. And that means it's going to be heavily colonized by different bacteria. So most studied, of course, is the large intestine. That was really the first area that people started to look at the bacteria that were living in it. And of course, part of this is because we all know that your poop has a lot of bacteria in it. And so it was easy to start looking at the colon and saying, hey, there's a lot of bacteria living here. But for the most part, there was originally thought to not be that many bugs living in your small intestine. It was assumed that because this was further up the gastrointestinal tract, that it wasn't going to be as heavily colonized by any kind of bugs. And now there's more investigation into this area, showing that there are specific bacteria that really live in your small intestine. And this can be really different from the bacteria that are living in your large intestine. So they're distinct environments as far as the bacteria themselves are concerned. There's also actually bacteria that live in your stomach. For the most part, people always assumed that because your stomach has so much acid in it to help you digest your food, it would really not be a good place for bacteria to live. They just wouldn't be able to handle that type of acidic environment. It would kill them. And then, of course, many years ago, someone started looking at ulcers. And they actually came to the conclusion that there might be bacteria that were causing ulcers. And thus was discovered a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. And it's now known that that actually colonizes most people's stomachs. But it's only about 20% of people who have Helicobacter pylori in their stomach that will actually develop ulcers. So it's kind of unclear as to whether this is always going to be a bug that causes a problem, or what other factors actually make it problematic for people. Within your mouth are also lots of bacteria. And you can think about this in terms of the fact that they're the bacteria that you're trying to get rid of when you're brushing your teeth or when you're using mouthwash. And one of these is called Porphyromonas gingivalis. And gingivalis should kind of sound familiar to you because, of course, we are all aware of gingivitis. And that's a type of gum inflammation. And it's caused by this P. gingivalis bacteria. There's lots of other bacteria in your mouth that we're not sure about the function. And some of them may be actually very important for keeping your mouth and your teeth healthy. Some of them seem to show greater associations with heart attacks later in life. And all of these connections are really still being studied. Of course, you also have lots of bacteria living on your skin because it's the part of your body that's going to come into the most contact with the outside world. And one of these is Propionibacterium acnes. Acnes, because yes, it is the bug that causes acne. But it's also just living on your skin. Another one that's commonly found on people's skin is the dreaded Staph aureus. So we've also all heard about this in terms of it causing almost a flesh-eating effect where it starts to really cause problems on your skin. But for the most part, a lot of people actually have this on their skin and don't suffer any kind of harm. If you have a cut or a break in your skin, sometimes that means that it can get into the wound, and a lot of the time that actually causes a problem. But for the most part, if it's just sitting on the outside of your skin, it's going to be okay. Your respiratory tract, again, has a lot of contact with the outside air when you inhale anything, so it's also very highly colonized. And one of the major bugs that's living there is called strep pneumonia. Strep pneumonia causes pneumonia, but it's usually present and doesn't actually do any kind of harm. Again, what happens is if you get sick, sometimes it can exacerbate the disease. So let's say you catch a flu virus. You're going to have an immune response, and you're going to have a lot of what's called inflammation, which is sort of loosely tissue damage. It's when you get a cut and it's infected and it turns red. That's inflammation. And any kind of disease actually causes inflammation. So sometimes when that happens, bacteria that are normally not a problem are going to have a chance to get out of check, and they'll start to grow and they'll cause a problem. And that's where you get pneumonia from strep. And finally, something we might not want to think about too much, there's also bacterial colonization of the urinary and vaginal tracts. There's also fungal colonization of the vaginal tract, and that is what can sometimes lead to what's known as yeast infections, in case you ever wondered what the Monistat commercials were all about. And there's also a lot of lactobacillus, which that should ring a bell too, because you often hear about lactobacillus as being one of those bacteria that are in yogurt that's supposed to be really healthy. And they seem to be really healthy when they're in this area too. And actually, when you don't have a lot of lactobacilli, what can happen is you'll get outgrowth of other types of bacteria, such as E. coli or Candida, which is a type of fungus. And in those cases, they cause disease. So the members of the microbiota can pretty much be broken down into three groups. On the one hand, you have bacteria that are known as symbionts. And these are really our friends. We need them. So this includes a lot of bacteria that are in your gut that make some vitamins that are important. So one of the biggest examples of these is that without the bacteria in your gut, you're not going to make a vitamin called vitamin K. And that's a really important vitamin to have normal blood clotting. So if you don't have enough vitamin K, you're going to get a lot of clotting problems, which means if you cut yourself, you're going to bleed quite a bit more than a normal person who's healthy will. There's also all kinds of other bacteria that are making different compounds that we haven't quite characterized yet. And these seem to be really important just for keeping your gut healthy, as well as for helping you to absorb the nutrients from your food. There are also bugs that we call commensals, and these, we're kind of indifferent to them. A lot of the times they need us as an environment to live. They're not going to live very well on their own, but they're not doing that much for us. One thing that we think they're doing is by actually growing there, they're just taking up space. So they occupy the real estate in your gut, and they mean that the more harmful bacteria can't grow and then cause you some kinds of problems. And then finally, there are what we call the pathobionts. And these are not good for us. So this is all kinds of bacteria that are in your gut, and normally they don't cause a problem. Again, because your symbionts and your commensals are helping to prevent them from growing too much. So they're there, but they're there in pretty small amounts, which means they're not actually going to do much damage to you. And what can happen is that any kinds of disturbances of the symbionts or the commensals gives these guys a chance to grow and be out of control. So the one of these that you might have heard of is called Clostridium difficile. And you've probably heard a lot about C. diff, as it's generally talked about, because who wants to say Clostridium difficile every single time? And this causes a lot of really bad diarrheal disease, particularly in patients who have been taking really high doses of antibiotics. And generally what's happening there is that antibiotics are really not very targeted. They're kind of like going after flies with a hammer. You're just banging the crap out of the bugs that are in your system. And that means that you're actually killing a lot of the good bugs as well as some of the bad. And so if you have pathobionts, that happen to be more resistant to those antibiotic drugs, they're actually going to start to grow more. So one of the very interesting things about the microbiota is actually how much it changes as you age. When you're a fetus in the uterus, you're actually sterile. It's a sterile environment. The placenta keeps all bacteria out, so you're completely not exposed to anything. But the second you're born, they start colonizing you. And some studies have shown that this can even be a difference between babies that are born with a cesarean section versus those that go through a normal delivery. Because if you're going through the normal delivery, you're of course traveling through the vagina, which we've already talked about is colonized with bacteria. And if you're being taken out by a C-section, you're going to be exposed first to the actual skin bacteria of your mom. And these things seem to really alter the bacteria that are actually going to be present in people as they age up. A lot of those differences have been shown to really disappear within the first couple years of age, but some of them seem to hold true even later. So as a baby, your microbiota is going to be affected by whether you were breastfed or formula fed. And then as you start to eat solid food, what you start to eat is also going to affect the bacteria that are colonizing you. And that's both because the food that you eat isn't sterile, it contains bacteria, even though they're not harmful ones. And it's also because what you eat has a huge effect on what bacteria are living in your gut, because they're also eating that too. There's only some digestion that actually occurs in your stomach, which is where you think about digestion really being. And then there's more digestion that occurs in your small intestine and again in your large intestine. And so the food that's available to you is going to be the food that's available to them. So it's really going to affect what bacteria are able to grow. And then, then you have, as children age up to being toddlers, they're going to have different types of bacteria based on whether they're normally healthy, whether they've received antibiotic treatments, and whether or not they're nourished appropriately. So when people have compared the microbiota between children who are, let's say, from impoverished areas in Africa and are therefore fed a very nutrient-poor diet versus children in the United States, the bacteria that are colonizing them are really very different. And we're still trying to figure out how this actually affects health long term. And then as you're an adult, one of the biggest differences can be seen between healthy people and people who are obese. And one of the interesting things here is that we actually don't know whether it's that the bacteria contribute to obesity or if actually being obese makes a difference in terms of what bacteria are able to colonize you. This is really being studied, and I'll actually come to some interesting studies about this a little bit later in the talk. And then we also know that as you become elderly, you also start to change your microbiota. So I know all of these discs with little different colored sections are kind of confusing. They indicate broadly different classes of bacteria that are present, and this is really just meant to show how all of these things can shift. And as I've already mentioned, they're affected by age and by diet, as well as by antibiotics or any kind of illness that you have. But it's also interesting that they can be affected by travel. So if you go somewhere really different, let's say you go to Mexico, you're going to be drinking a different source of water, eating different types of food, and they're going to have different types of bacteria. Most of the time, this only affects your microbiota short term, and it seems like people tend to come back to a really stable mix of bacteria in their guts. But there can be changes depending on how long you live somewhere or how permanently you're in that environment. But the biggest point to all of this is that having a diverse gut is really a healthy gut. Most of the time they've shown that if you have too much of any one group of bacteria, it seems to throw your balance off. And while it's not entirely clear why this affects health so dramatically, it really does. So you're probably constantly hearing mentions of the microbiome in the news. I mean, we have all of these headlines coming out about how it might affect how fat or skinny you are, about how it even affects the calories that you can take in without gaining weight. the possibility that infant microbiomes may determine how much someone develops autoimmunity later in life. Lots of news about this idea of fecal transplants, which doesn't actually mean that you have to eat somebody else's poop. What it does is they actually purify from a stool sample from somebody else who's presumably healthy. They purify the bacteria and they replace the bacteria in your gut with those, with the hope that they'll take over and restore whatever kind of balance. Mostly this has really been shown to be a good treatment when people have bad C. difficile infections, because it seems like giving them a healthy mix of bacteria can finally drive down those C. diff bacteria and restore health. But even more interesting lately has been this kind of branching out to say, besides just gut health, where we know the bacteria are directly living, how do they affect other systems of the body? And so this has led to recent headlines that talk about whether or not bacteria in the mouth and throat seem to be linked to the development of schizophrenia, or even how gut microbes actually interact with your nervous system, and particularly with your mood. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple of minutes. So focusing still on the bacteria in the intestine, because this is the area that's been studied the most and for the longest, and seems to have the best studies so far. What we really know is that what matters is where these bacteria are. So here, these cells are the actual epithelial cells of your intestine. And that means that they're the wall. When you look at someone's intestine, they're what you're actually seeing. They form the outer core of that. And they're important for absorbing nutrients, but they're also important for essentially forming a fence. Because on this side, you have your food that's being processed, and you also have the bacteria that are living there. And on this side, you really have all of your immune cells. And in general, one of the reasons your gut knows, your immune system knows that a bacteria is bad is if it's in this portion of your intestine. Because bacteria really shouldn't be there. But in addition to this, you also have immune cells that are constantly sort of sucking up different bacterial components that are in your gut as if through a straw. And this allows them to sample these bacteria and just kind of keep tabs on it so that they can determine whether or not something is there that shouldn't be there, something is growing in larger numbers that could be unhealthy, and then you can start to mount an immune response. One of the important things here is to maintain what are known as tight junctions. So that means that these cells are really butted up close against one another, and there's a solid wall that they're forming. Because again, anytime that these bacteria get from your gut into your bloodstream, you're probably going to end up with some kind of problem. Generally, your immune system can combat this pretty well, and so you don't get sick, but every once in a while, it can lead to disease. And at the same time, these commensal bacteria that live in here have pretty much evolved with us, so they don't tend to try and get past that gut barrier, because where they're living in this interior environment is where they have all of those resources that they need. They function best living there because they have their direct access to food. They have no real reason to try and get past this barrier into the bloodstream because that's not the nutrient environment that they need to grow in. Whereas a lot of bacteria that are pathogens are not as well adapted to this area as they might be to living in your bloodstream. And this is one of those ways that what we call pathobionts can start to cause infections, is when they're in the gut, they're not able to do anything bad to harm you, but as soon as they can get across this gut barrier, that's when you start to have problems. And so anything that disturbs this gut barrier is probably also going to lead to higher rates of infection with bacteria that are living there, that are pathobionts, that are going to cause disease. And things that can do that are gluten sensitivities, which is what you hear about when you hear about celiac disease. It can also be colitis, Crohn's disease, these kinds of things that we know cause inflammation in the gut. And we're not sure how much of that inflammation is due to genetic abnormalities and how much is due to the actual bacteria themselves. So we also know that the microbiota itself is really important for actually training the immune system. And here what you can see is you've got this person who's totally isolated from these mice, because these mice have no bacteria in them. What happens is they take mice and they perform a cesarean section on them. And that actually allows them to get the pups out and raise them in a sterile environment so that these mice have absolutely no microbial things in them whatsoever. And that makes them very useful for all kinds of studies. These are called germ-free mice. And we already know just by looking at the germ-free mice alone that they have a really messed up immune system, including they have fewer antibodies, and antibodies are what protects you when you get an immunization, say. We also know that they have fewer lymph nodes, and lymph nodes are a critical component of your immune system that actually allows you to have immune responses. They're the parts of your neck and throat that you'll feel that are swollen whenever you have an infection, because they actually get larger. And they're getting larger because you're forming an immune response. So without those lymph nodes, you're not going to have a good immune response. And we also know that these mice have worse what's called immunoregulation, which is the ability of your immune system to control itself so that you don't develop an autoimmune disease. What's kind of neat about these germ-free mice is that we can actually colonize them in a custom order type of way. So we can give them what's called normal microbiota, which would just be whatever most mice in a mouse room have. But they can also be colonized with a single specific strain of bacteria. And that lets us look at what might be the actual effect of any individual bacteria. And that can be a really important tool for trying to connect individual bacteria with the development of certain diseases. And they can also be very useful for studying what we call probiotics. So all of those things that you see advertised again in yogurt commercials, where they're talking about good bugs, can be studied in this kind of an environment to see what effect those bacteria by themselves have on the actual development of the immune system. And with these germ-free mice, one of the things that's really been studied that I think is applicable to everybody is that you get this immune window for the development of allergies. So you might not know this, but your immune system is actually responsible for allergies. It's not that pollen does something specific to you. It's actually that your immune system sees that pollen, thinks it's a bug of some kind, and attacks it, even though it's not actually going to hurt you. I mean, you're not going to like suffocate from pollen or something like that. And so what happens is you get exposed to these things and you develop an allergy. And we're still trying to understand how these allergies actually happen, why some people have them, why other people don't. And one of the things that might be really important is when you actually get colonized by particular species of bacteria. And this feeds into what you might have heard of as the hygiene hypothesis, which says that we actually keep children who are very young too clean. And so they're not exposed to enough bacteria to really develop a good and healthy immune system that won't kind of attack your body by itself. So when you get a normal mouse and you expose it to a dust mite allergen, I mean, lots of people are allergic to dust, right? They actually tend not to develop an allergic response, which includes anaphylaxis, which is the closing up of your throat, the inability to breathe, all of that kind of stuff. And if you take one of those germ-free mice that I was talking about, and you colonize them with a normal type of bacteria, so what this mouse has, if you do it between birth and 4 weeks old, which is really kind of like mouse early childhood, at 4 weeks they're more like teenagers, they also have a really low risk of developing allergic responses. But if you take these mice and you don't give them a normal microbiota until more than 4 weeks after they're born, they have a really high risk of allergic disease. So this kind of leads into this idea that, as Hippocrates said thousands of years ago, all disease begins in the gut. We have a lot of evidence that says that a lot of these diseases, which are actually all diseases of your immune system behaving like it shouldn't and attacking your body, are actually linked to the microbiota. And so we know that Crohn's disease and multiple sclerosis and arthritis and lupus can be really severely affected by the bacteria that are in your gut. Things have been done with mice that show that if you selectively are able to reduce or increase different bacterial populations, you can worsen or make better a lot of these different diseases. But what's really important to remember is that this effect of the microbiota is part of the environmental aspect of this equation. So it's not like if you mess with the bacteria in a mouse that's normally healthy, you're going to create this kind of disease. That seems to be also determined by genetics. So this is part of what you might have heard of as the genes plus environment stuff that you hear, the genes plus environment aspects of the development of autoimmune disease. So when people started sequencing the human genome, they thought, hey, we'll find the genes for disease X, Y, Z, we'll be able to cure all of them. And with our actual understanding of the genome, we've come to find out that there's a huge difference between genetics being solely determinative of a disease and it being a complex reaction of genetics and environment. So, segueing into some more recent studies that have been done, I promised I'd tell you about how it seems like the gut bacteria can actually alter your mood. So one of the things that they found when they started doing experiments with those germ-free mice was that they actually seemed to have lower ability to navigate mazes, to perform other kinds of things that we've shown have been indicative of mouse thinking and ability to remember things. And they also showed much higher stress responses. So if you made loud noises or if you changed the temperatures, they would have much higher stress responses. And if you actually gave these mice a normal bacteria, then they would start to reverse those kinds of effects. So that led people to start wondering how the microbiota might be affecting aspects of your brain. And it's long been known that there's what's called the gut-brain axis. In fact, some people even refer to the gut as your second brain because it's so tightly connected to your brain by what's known as the vagus nerve. This nerve directly goes from your brain into your digestive tract, and there's a lot of crosstalk between these two that actually affects how rapidly you digest something, how much you're able to think. I mean, think about how sleepy and sedentary you can feel after a really large meal. Some of that is just because you're actually shunting blood to your digestive system to help digest the food. But scientists also think that some of it is actually because you're changing different types of chemicals in the gut by what's being digested, and that these actually interact with your nervous system to change how you're feeling. One thing that's very interesting is that they've shown that there are actually higher levels of what they term depression in mice that are germ-free. And they think this is because the germ-free mice, they seem to have lower levels of serotonin. So if you've ever watched TV and seen an antidepressant commercial, they're usually talking about serotonin because it seems like lower serotonin is an aspect of depression. And so they think that there might be this link between the bacteria that are colonizing your gut and the amount of serotonin in your brain, and therefore how depressed you might feel. And now, the thing that people are probably most concerned about, because everywhere you're hearing about the obesity epidemic and how much of a cost strain it is on our healthcare system, as well as just personal interest in it. And one of the interesting things about this is that they've directly shown that the microbiota can affect how obese a mouse will get. So the way they did this was they took these germ-free mice, and then they found twins where they were genetically identical, but one of the twins had developed obesity and the other twin was much leaner. And if they took the bacteria from the guts of the obese twin and they gave it to one of these germ-free mice, that mouse would develop severe obesity. But if they took the gut bacteria from the lean twin and gave it to a germ-free mouse, that mouse would stay pretty lean. So this, of course, is with mice that are fed the exact same diet. So we know that it's not diet dependent in this particular experiment, and that it really seems to be something about this microbiota. And because these twins are genetically identical, it doesn't seem to be that the genetics controlled whether or not the twin had that type of bacteria in their gut that seems to confer the obesity, but rather that somehow this twin's gut bacteria vary from this one. And that could be due to antibiotic exposure in young children. It could be due to some kind of bacterial infection that you had that changed your microbiota. But the other thing is, this could also be due to the diet that one twin eats and the other one doesn't. So we still don't know for sure whether your gut bacteria changes because you have a diet that leads to obesity, or if you are predisposed to obesity because you have those gut bacteria. And then if you eat a diet that's maybe not so healthy, you end up with obesity. Another thing that I thought was really kind of cool as an experiment was that if they then took these lean and obese mice and they put them together in the same cage, if you gave an obese colonized mouse the lean bacteria and you fed them a pretty healthy diet, those bacteria would transfer and the obese mouse would actually not become obese. But at the same time, if you gave them a high-fat, low-fiber diet and you tried to put a lean mouse with an obese mouse, that mouse would still get obese. And also, if you put an obese mouse with a lean mouse, the lean mouse won't get obese. So somehow, the lean bacteria are able to take over and displace the obese bacteria, but the obese bacteria can't seem to displace the lean bacteria. So this has offered a lot of hope that people think, well, maybe we could help reduce obesity by giving people fecal transplants. This is still a very kind of hypothetical thing, but of course everyone wants to cling to it as a hope because it would represent a really easy way to help make people not obese and increase their health. That was the transfer by co-housing that I was just talking about. So again, I really want to emphasize that there's this really complicated interplay between your microbiota and obesity, and that this is influenced by diet and genetics, and that this could be because depending on your gut bacteria, you may get increased calorie extraction. So the bacteria in person A's gut may be more efficient, which generally we like efficiency, but in this case maybe not, than the bacteria in someone who's not obese. These bacteria could also be maybe making different metabolites that could affect how your cells are being regulated, so they affect how you're actually storing adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. And then there seems to be this correlation between inflammation and fat storage. And so if you have bacteria that are causing inflammation in your gut, it's possible that those are also changing how you store fat. And these are all ways that changing your gut bacteria might actually affect how you're storing fat and therefore whether you're lean or obese. And finally, I just want to point out that this is really a huge area of investigation. There are a number of countries that have started to fund all of these different initiatives aimed at collecting stool samples from hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, depending on how many they can sequence. And they're hoping that this will give us a broad picture in different countries about what the microbiome looks like and how this might correlate with health. Because it's entirely possible that a wide variety of different profiles of bacteria may make you healthy or unhealthy, whether this is by autoimmune disease development or by adiposity or any other kind of number of factors, allergies, etc. And part of the hope is that we might see differences between countries like the US that have really high rates of autoimmune disease and allergy and obesity, as well as higher reported rates, at least, of depression and other kinds of mental illness. We might see big differences between microbiomes sequenced from this area versus those from, let's say, France or China or Canada, because we all know they're happier up in Canada. And just gathering all of this data, we hope to see really interesting patterns that could lead to better scientific discoveries and understanding. So in closing, I just kind of want to emphasize that this is still a very new area of interest. Some of these experiments are decades old, but it's only very recently that we've come to have the tools that allow us to really see what bacteria are where and how they're affecting health. So don't go out and worry that your microbiome is off and you need to suddenly down all kinds of probiotics, because we still don't know exactly how that is affecting you. But eating yogurt isn't going to hurt. So any questions?
How does stress play into, what type of reaction does it have on?
So when you're stressed, you're actually going to you're actually having a broad state of inflammation in your body. So stress releases cortisone. Cortisone is a hormone that also affects the way immune cells are acting, and they actually tell those immune cells that they need to make this inflammatory response. And inflammation is sort of a very general term, and mostly what it means is that your immune cells become activated. And when they're activated, they start to produce chemicals that can actually damage your own tissue, because they're trying to spew out all kinds of compounds that are known as antimicrobials, because they don't have a specific target to go after like they would if you were undergoing a flu infection, let's say. And instead, they're just kind of like, something is not right, we need to respond and try and kill whatever this is. But of course, if you're stressed, there's nothing to kill. And so instead, you get misdirected immune responses, and those start to actually impact your own healthy tissue. And when you're killing your own healthy tissue, you're creating areas for bacteria to start to get in, because you no longer have that solid wall of defense. And that's how they think your gut may actually be affecting then other parts of your body when you have a state of general inflammation. And some of this you might have heard of terms of leaky gut. And the leaky gut is referring to that kind of inflammation, because what's happening is you're breaking down those tight walls between your epithelial cells in your intestine that are normally supposed to keep bacteria out of the bloodstream. And instead, you now have bacteria getting into the bloodstream. So now, not only do you have this general stress response that's causing inflammation, but you have bacteria getting into your bloodstream and activating the immune response there too. And so that is just going to create a general state of unhealth. And we're not sure exactly how that feeds into maybe your brain chemistry, maybe the development of allergies, depending on when maybe this happens when you're a young child. But it seems to be a lot of correlation within studies with changing that microbiota and these subsequent differences in health.
Thank you.
Yes?
Fecal transplant and altering the microbiome presents a unique problem in that we don't have like a standard for what's a good.
Correct, and that's part of where these microbiome projects come in, is the idea that you might be able to come up with different types of fecal transplants that could be beneficial. And again, part of it is we don't really know. I mean, we can, right now, the state of the science is highly experimental, and so it's not really approved as a treatment per se. It's still something that's very experimental, and a lot of the times doctors will still do it because if you've got someone who's got colitis and they've undergone several surgeries to remove sections of their intestine because that intestinal tissue has been so damaged, this becomes a last resort in a lot of cases, is that it's kind of like, well, we can't hurt much at this point, and it might dramatically improve this person's quality of life. And in that case, they'll go ahead, usually they'll take a relative of yours who is healthy, and they'll do everything they can to try and screen the contents of that fecal sample and make sure that there aren't any pathogenic bacteria in it. But one of the problems that this also presents is we still don't know everything about what's living in your gut. And if we don't know that something's there, we can't screen for it. It's the same thing as the blood supply before we really identified HIV as a blood-transmitted virus. There's no way to screen for it if you don't know it exists. And the studies of the microbiome are still kind of in the early stages. It's only within the past decade or so that we've actually been able to determine what's in the gut. And part of this is we have all of these genetic sequencing things now. And those tools allow us to look at what particular species of bacteria are in your gut. Before, the way they used to do it was to take a fecal sample, plate out those bacteria, and grow them up. And part of the problem with that is, again, if we don't know what's in the gut, we don't know how to make it grow. So you're actually just kind of going to end up seeing the bacteria that you know how to grow, as opposed to all of the bacteria that's in there. So again, this is going to present some problems, but so far it does seem to be a promising treatment, even if we don't understand quite how it works.
How far off do you think we are from knowing what normal is, or being able to?
Well, the question with that is more, I think, not what's normal, but what's beneficial.
Sure.
Because the idea isn't necessarily to find a normal standardized gut. That may not really exist. People might fall into different categories of normal, again, because we know that there's this big interplay of genetics and environment and life history. And so that may really vary. But I think the hope with a lot of these huge, and as you can see, they are huge. I mean, they're spending millions of dollars to do this. So a lot of the hope is that by doing this with so many different samples, we can get a profile, and then maybe we can actually come up with almost a synthetic version of it where we can see, okay, these bacteria seem to be good, and we can test them in a germ-free mouse and show that they don't cause any kind of harm. And then maybe we can put them all together into a sterile mixture just by isolating them and culturing them, and maybe give that to someone, and it will restore a healthy gut. And a lot of times I think it's just going to be experimental.
What's your thought on, I hear different opinions that we in the United States are now starting to use too much antibacterial soaps,
Yeah.
and so that we're actually doing more harm than good? Like, what's the truth behind that?
So most of the studies seem to say that that really is true. I mean, scientists, and particularly biomedical health people, have been arguing for the past 2 decades or so that we really use too much sterilization. Not sterilization in a hospital setting, but in our normal day-to-day lives. So the bacteria that are living on you have pretty much co-evolved with us to be there and be healthy. And so by killing them off whenever you wash your hands with an antibacterial soap, or you use Purell, which kills a lot of germs, or when you're, see now even part of what they're looking at is that we use so much antibiotics that they're actually getting excreted from you, as well as antibiotics that get excreted from livestock, which we feed lots of antibiotics because as a secondary effect that they're really not clear about, it seems to increase growth rates in a lot of livestock animals. And so those are so present and built up in the environment that they're actually starting to cause changes in our environmental bacteria. And as we talked about, or as I mentioned, your environment can profoundly affect what you're colonized with. So the question is that long-term causing differences in what we're colonized with? But in general, I would say that most scientific thought is that we really are overusing those things, and that you would be better off to limit how much you're using them. Using just regular soap and water is going to clean off most of your non-resident bacteria, and this has to do with properties about, like, the bacteria that's on your skin is really what's known as adherent. It's specialized to stay there and not to come off very easily, whereas contaminating bacteria, let's say from when you go to the bathroom, or, you know, butchering something and you touch intestinal contents, those may not be so well adapted to actually stay on your skin. And so the mechanical motion even of just scrubbing your hands with soap is going to get rid of a lot of them. And they're also present in really low numbers. Like, even if you think about contamination from, you know, you cut up a raw chicken on a cutting board, and then you cut up some vegetables on it. Part of what happens is that those bacteria, which are present in small numbers, can then start to grow. And again, it's when they get to large numbers that they cause a problem. So small numbers of them on your skin bacteria may be able to prevent them from growing and therefore prevent them from doing bad things. I'm not advocating that, like, if you're working with raw meat or anything like that, you shouldn't be washing your hands and washing cutting boards and all that. But you might not have to take the Lysol wipes to everything in your kitchen every single day. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
Hope
good.
you learned
It's good.
something.
It was very